Okay, we're gonna get a little bit artsy with the last part. We have to turn over to your own creativity over here. But basically, what happens is we're now going to go through and understand in the minutia really of God's involvement with taking us out. So it says that and there's a tradition that not tradition. What we do is we take a little bit of the wine out of our second cup and take it out, because as we talk about the suffering of the Egyptians, we want to in a small way lessen our own suffering. You'd think to yourself, well, these people were worse than the Nazis. Why should we be suffering with them? But thankfully we have an extra measure of compassion, so that shouldn't seem like such a strange thing. That just because the bad people are being punished, that we shouldn't really delight in their suffering. We should only delight really in our own salvation and the justice that was served. But we shouldn't really, be happy about the suffering of other people. So you say blood, fire, and columns of smoke. And then it goes through and it starts to count all of the different ways that we know that God did more and more and more plagues. And then it goes through and explains. We say all 10 of the plagues. I'm just going to run through in really doing it not enough justice what the plagues were. The dam was the blood. Basically what happened was God turned all the water in the entire world into blood. Specifically the Nile. Now the Egyptians worshipped the Nile. The Nile would flood regularly, and the Egyptians always had plenty to eat, and so they worshipped that, the source of their livelihood. They worshipped the source of their livelihood. Not that ever happens in modern day society. But what God essentially did was He killed metaphorically the source of their livelihood. And God says, really, the reason why the water floods, the reason why the stock market works, and why economies go up and down, and everyone just magically has kind of enough to get around, it's because I'm controlling it. But if you worship that independent of me, I could cut that off at any time. The frogs, it explains basically, there's a lot we can say about this. Basically, the frogs didn't let the Egyptians sleep at night. And the Egyptians were in the Jews' life all the time, not letting us sleep at night and never letting us have any peace. The lice was horrific. At this point, the Egyptians realized that there was no way that Moses was just fabricating these plagues. Really, they saw that only God could be doing it, because the lice was this freaky kind of lice that even the priests had it, and the part of the priests, what they would do was they would shave all the hair on their body. So how could someone who has no hair have lice? These lice go to people even if they don't have any hair. Wild beasts. Fantastic, right? What were the wild beasts? The wild beasts, God basically took out the natural fear that animals have of people, and also miraculously was only attacking the Egyptians. The Jewish people would be wandering around, and there would be this huge bear that would just come out of nowhere and slaughter the guy next to you, and then would kind of look at you if you were a Jewish person and walk away. So basically, yeah, you would just be sitting there randomly having your cup of coffee, and the next thing lions and tigers and some freaky antelope or something like that would come wandering around and just start goring people. And the Egyptians were horrified, and they went running in their house. And what they find as soon as they run into their house, snakes and spiders and scorpions just coming and running at them also. So it was really horrific. Next would be the pestilence, which was the horrific diseases, and then then you had the boils. The boils were, I'm just looking over here at some of my notes over here, make sure I'm obviously going to forget a lot of this stuff. That's why you have to review it. The boils were special kind of boils that actually, sorry, forgive me, that basically there's certain boils that are dry and itchy, and other ones that are like deep embedded and like not itchy, not wet. I'm sorry, that are wet. They're whatever. Anyone that's gone through puberty and has acne issues, as myself did, knows about these different kinds of things. And basically, God made the boils were both. They were both like itchy, and they were really like deep and like really super painful, and it was horrifically painful. The hail was phenomenal in that it was ice that had fire inside. So it was these huge balls of ice, and there was fire inside, so ice would come crashing down and hit, and then it would light everything on fire. You tell yourself, well, wow, I didn't realize that fire and ice could go together. That's the whole point. The whole point is that God was completely suspending nature. He was playing with nature at this point, and just showing people that there was this nature thing that we see, that it's all just a figment of our imagination, and really God is at play at the whole time. The locust came and completely annihilated whatever was left of the crops. and the darkness was so thick that they literally couldn't move, and the Egyptians couldn't move. And the Jewish people had light; it was light, and they went around basically and just checked all the Egyptian stuff because God promised that when the Jews would be redeemed, so the Jewish people would go out with great wealth. And so the Jewish people found all the Bentleys in the Egyptian people's garage. And interestingly enough, after all the plagues were done, the Egyptians randomly, again, showing you that anti-Semitism and love for the Jews also is not rational. God put a love back in the hearts of the Egyptians. They're like, hey, thanks so much for the slavery. Sorry about that. Let me pay you for it. And they were giving us stuff. And since we during the plague of darkness had gone around and found all of the nice stuff, so we knew where it was. So, they'd give us all the jewelry and be like, don't you have that Rolls Royce in the garage that you were meaning to give me? They'd be like, oh yeah, the Rolls. Yeah, I forgot about that. You knew about. Okay, great. Yeah, absolutely. It was also scary because 4/5 or 499th out of 500 or 4999, I think the math's right, I hope that, out of 5,000 percentages of Jews died in Mitzrayim. Most of the Jews died in Mitzrayim in the 9th plague. Why? So the answer was after, and this is going to be very profound, after the first 8 plagues, where the Jewish people saw that this little thing we call nature doesn't really exist. And this military superpower known as Egypt that we lived in for 210 years. Think about it. Most of the Jews have not been in America for more than, 70, 80, 100 years. We were in Egypt for generations and generations. We knew it. We were Egyptians. We paid the taxes. We were so much a part of that culture. It was like a fixture in our mind. And in front of our own eyes, the whole thing came down. Like literally God just ripped the mask off of nature. He's like, shalom, I'm over here, right? So the idea is that after we saw all of that, when we were so impacted, and this is a very deep idea, right? When you see something like that, you have to change, right? When you see something so profound, you can't go back to your normal life and just say, okay, so I guess we're going to work tomorrow. Dude, there's no work. The whole institution that you were working with, it's no longer there. The whole country isn't there. Everything's over. Things are different now, right? It's like a new dawn, right? So, but what do we see? Most of the Jews, the mass majority of the Jews, after seeing everything, they're like, yeah, as terrible as it was in Egypt, this whole thing that I'm seeing, this new stuff, I don't know if I really will. I'm not so into that. Can I go back to my day job, to which it says that the people died in Egypt. They died in Egypt because they couldn't progress with the world. And it's a very profound idea. A lot of times people say, if I would see miracles like I did, like there was in Egypt, if only I would see it, I would change my life. I'd become a person that was always focusing on godliness and spiritual growth. I never saw it. I never saw the plagues. I don't believe, I don't know but if I would see it though, I would change. The Chagad is saying a phenomenal concept, which is that no, you wouldn't. Most of us wouldn't change. Most of us would have died in Egypt. And only very special people who said, you know what, no matter what, if I see something, if I am moved, if I'm going to go wherever it takes me, right? Those are the only people that made it out. Most people that would see something would want to go back to their normal life because we're so stuck in our habits. On the last one's death, the firstborn, we know that the firstborn of the fathers and the firstborn of the mothers died. In Egypt, it was kind of, again, back then, one time I gave a speech and people thought I was being rude about Egypt today. But Egypt back then was a very immoral place. And there was lots of firstborns that nobody knew was really whose firstborn was what or where or who. So you might have the third kid die and be like, well, why did that kid die? And the father would be like, well, that's really awkward. It was actually my firstborn kid with, Susan down the block. I know who Susan is, but whatever it is. So they would also, it was crazy the amount of pinpoint accuracy that God had to wipe out all the firstborn. And the reason why he was wiping it out is because it says that the Egyptians went after his firstborn. He says that there's a line that explains that God sees Israel as his firstborn, and the Egyptians started up with his firstborn. So he was rewriting the wrong that had been done by taking out their firstborn. Then there's an analogy, and then we go through. It's very interesting, an acronym, sorry, for all the plagues. And then we go through. It's so interesting that the rabbis were calculating just how many plagues were going on. And so a lot of people read this like, what in the world's going on? There's 50 plagues, maybe there's 500. There's so many. What are all the plagues? And so the idea is that, and it's a very profound idea for life, that once you start to look into the miracles that are being done for you, you realize it's not just a miracle. I'll share a short story. Yisrael Salanter was he was a big rabbi, and he one time was sitting at a coffee shop in Paris, and he was overcharged. And he was like, "Oh my gosh, I ordered a cup of coffee. This is before Starbucks, and that was normal. What's $4.50 for a cup of coffee?" And he started thinking to himself again. The average person would either pay it because they didn't want to say anything, or would, feel like they were cheated by the system and they'd start some kind of a riot or revolution. Maybe some smart business person would open up, the place next door and charge just a little bit less than that. But Yisrael Salanter, who was a master of this spirit, thought to himself, well, why was it so expensive? What was the lesson over there? And what he learned was the following concept. He said that it's not just the coffee I'm paying for. I'm paying for the ambiance. I'm paying for the hotel. I'm paying for the whole scenery and all the atmosphere. And this amazing thing. It wasn't, when I come to this particular coffee joint, I'm not buying the coffee. I'm buying the mood and the atmosphere. So you're saying the same thing's true. If you have to become an expert in pleasure to look into just how good we all have it. How many times do we just think about how great it is that we can just stand up in the morning, that we can breathe, that we can eat and sleep, and we can see, and we're not paralyzed, and that our minds work properly, and that we have people that like us, and friends, and Facebook, and I mean, think about it. Like, when would I ever have the opportunity to talk to whoever wants to watch this? It never happened in all of human history. I was such a lucky person. I was born, and I learned so much from rabbis, both that I met and all the rabbis I listened to on tape and on video and stuff like that. So you have to realize that God does so much good for us. So the idea was the rabbis were trying to train us. It's not just God did 10 plagues. You look into each one of the plagues and you look into what happened. He was doing hundreds of thousands of things that were good for us. And that leads us to the next thing, which will lead us right to the very end of this official part of the Learn How to Do Your Own Seder.